It's a pencil drawing. It's a rendering of David and Goliath, a really gory rendering. David's got a slingshot in his hand, and somehow with that slingshot, he's managed to decapitate Goliath. So David's got Goliath's head in his hand. Goliath's headless corpse is at David's feet. And the name Tiller, as in Dr. George Tiller, is written on the decapitated Goliath head. The headless corpse is labeled child murdering industry. And the whole gory, shocking pencil art celebration and attempted justification of the murder of Dr. George Tiller is autographed by the man charged with killing Dr. Tiller. And you could buy that. Scott Roeder is charged with first-degree murder in Dr. Tiller's death. Dr. Tiller was shot at point-blank range inside his church on May 31st of this year. Scott Roeder's supporters are planning to auction off that signed artwork, the David and Goliath celebration of Dr. Tiller's murder and more, to fund Mr. Roeder's defense. Judy Thomas reported for the Kansas City Star this weekend that the openly pro-violence extreme fringe of the anti-abortion movement is planning an auction of anti-abortion terrorist ephemera and souvenirs to benefit Mr. Roeder. In addition to the prison art signed by Mr. Roeder himself, they're also planning on auctioning off a cookbook of recipes you can make in prison, written by the woman who shot Dr. Tiller in 1993, before Mr. Roeder allegedly did so and killed him this year. They're also planning on putting a minimum bid of $500 on a VHS tape of people praying for that woman who shot Dr. Tiller before her trial back in the 90s. They think they can get $500 for that VHS tape because the person featured praying on that tape is Paul Hill, who assassinated another doctor and a 74-year-old clinic escort in 1994. Paul Hill has since been executed by the state of Florida, making him even more of a hero to the anti-abortion movement's terrorist fringe. Another anti-abortion activist who spent years in prison for bombing abortion clinics, Michael Bray, is donating an autographed copy of his book, A Time to Kill, which promotes violence against abortion providers and facilities and purports to justify it. Before Scott Roeder allegedly killed Dr. Tiller, he subscribed to and had letters published in a Kansas newsletter that's called Prayer and Action News. Prayer and Action News is a publication that openly advocates the murder of doctors who perform abortions. The publisher of that newsletter is organizing this benefit auction for Mr. Roeder, and he himself is making his own donation. His own donation is a 1996 first edition of the manual for the so-called Army of God. The Army of God today on their website praises Scott Roeder as an American hero for having allegedly killed Dr. Tiller. In 1996, the Army of God's printed manual went beyond praising and advocating violence against American doctors and against facilities that provided abortions. The Army of God in that printed manual in 1996 actually explained how to do that, giving detailed instructions on how to shut down clinics, including how to build bombs to blow them up. An original copy of that terrorist classic will be auctioned to benefit and, frankly, to celebrate the latest member of this movement that celebrates and promotes this kind of violence to have at least allegedly made good on the murder that these folks promise. Joining us now is Lee Thompson. He's an attorney who represented the late Dr. George Tiller for 16 years. He's currently the attorney for Dr. Tiller's widow and the doctor's estate. Mr. Thompson, thanks very much for coming on this show.
Thank you for having me.
First, I'll just ask for your reaction or the reaction of Dr. Tiller's family to this planned fundraising effort for Mr. Roeder.
Well, obviously, we believe that this is nothing more than a reprehensible publicity stunt that is fostered by the same people trying to sell the same publications that generated the climate of hatred and fear that led to Dr. Tiller's murder. Fortunately, it's probably also a useless exercise because the drawings and other materials from criminals would generate funds that ought to be attached by the Kansas Victims Compensation Fund under our Son of Sam law. So obviously, if this goes ahead, we'll be asking the Attorney General of Kansas to simply attach whatever funds and use them to help other victims of crimes.
Separate from the question of fundraising, or as you say, it would in this case probably be attempted fundraising, how present are your concerns about more violence coming from the radical anti-abortion movement? Certainly it is troubling to see Mr. Roeder, as he sits there charged with first-degree murder in Dr. Tiller's death, to see him celebrated in this way.
Absolutely. And I think it's obvious when you look at these very materials that it's the rhetoric that was promoted by these groups that has led to violence. The handbook of the Army of God, for example, had hints on gluing locks at abortion clinics, which Roeder did in Kansas City. Hints and directions on flooding clinic roofs, which they did to Dr. Tiller's clinic in Wichita, bombing instructions, and other violent directions that all led to that climate that made people think it was okay to do this. They also suggested, I think, that it was justified and thus gave the impression that there was some justification, a defense which the law has routinely rejected.
Since Dr. Tiller's murder, clearly the very far fringe, the violent fringe of the anti-abortion movement has decided to celebrate Mr. Roeder. The pro-choice movement, and I think a lot of centrists who didn't see themselves as allied with this issue at all before Dr. Tiller's murder, have also organized in the wake of the assassination, and I think tried to change minds and try to change the climate in the country in the wake of that assassination. What's been your reaction to the overall way in which Dr. Tiller's murder has affected the country on both sides?
Well, obviously, any attempt to use it to promote anti-abortion feelings is awful. It is sick. It is the worst possible thing that could be done. This was a criminal act. It was a premeditated act, and anything that says it was okay or good is simply wrong. Dr. Tiller provided a service that provided constitutionally protected rights for his patients, and it's extremely disturbing that the climate of fear is still being generated. Whether or not it should be used to promote the pro-choice approach is something that I'll leave up to those who are doing it. I think the family would just as soon people remember Dr. Tiller for the service he gave to women over a long and distinguished career.
Mr. Thompson, what happens next in the case of Scott Roeder? I wonder if legally you believe that we can conclude from this fundraising effort that he's going to try to put abortion rights on trial, that he'll try to put the memory of Dr. Tiller on trial in his own defense.
Well, they say the fundraiser is to hire an attorney to advance what's called the necessity defense, a justification for some violent act. But that's been routinely rejected by virtually every court, and it's certainly been rejected by the Supreme Court of Kansas, which in 1993, in an abortion case, said to permit such a defense would invite chaos and perhaps could lead ultimately to anarchy. So I can't imagine that any judge sitting in Wichita, Kansas, would go against the Kansas Supreme Court on that issue. I think that we really don't see that sort of publicity stunt working in Kansas courts very often, and I believe with everything I hold dear that that will be the case in this case.
Lee Thompson, attorney for Dr. George Tiller's widow and Dr. Tiller's estate. I know this has been an upsetting turn of events both for you and Dr. Tiller's family. Thanks for being willing to talk to us about it tonight.
Appreciate your having us. Thank you.
Thank you.